Hello and welcome to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast, where each week, Pastor Jeff Cranston explores biblical theology that provides practical life applications in an understandable way. Thanks for joining us at the table. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to Kitchen Table Theology. I'm your host, Tiffany Coker, and along with my dad, Pastor Jeff Cranston, we have been working our way through a series on historical theology, learning about some of the earliest church leaders, some of our church history, and why it matters to us. What can we learn from it? What is our takeaway? And so I hope you have been enjoying this series as we've been walking through that. All right, Kitchen Table Theologian, have you ever thought about what it would have been like to sit across the table from someone who knew Jesus? Today, we pull out our phones, we can find out information on just about anything in seconds, right? There are recordings, videos, photographs, books, endless resources, all the information that we need right at our fingertips. But the earliest followers of Jesus lived in a very different world, a very different time. The story of Christ and his life on this earth was not passed along through podcasts, emails, websites, social media, right? It was passed along through people.
That's how it went. And Kitchen Table Theologian, welcome. It's so good to have you back with us. And all that you said there, Tiff, it's really fascinating when you think about it. Before the New Testament was I have a hard time saying widely, not wildly, widely. Before the New Testament was widely copied and distributed, the message about Jesus was being carried, pretty much only by eyewitnesses and those who had learned directly from them. And that brings us to the subject of today's podcast. One of the earliest church fathers in what we call the Patristic period was Papias of Hierapolis. What a mouthful. Papias of Hierapolis. And Hieropolis is now in present-day Turkey. Irenaeus, we talked about Irenaeus a few podcasts ago. He shares that Papias was a hearer. He called him a quote-unquote hearer of the Apostle John. We also know that Papias was a companion to Polycarp. And so Papias, therefore, is a significant link to the apostolic era.
So he lived when John lived, but he went on to live well past John. So we say he lived in the apostolic generation, but he has some crossover there into the first generation after the apostles.
Right.
Okay, Dad, tell us, what was Papias's claim to fame, right? Why are we talking about him today? What do we need to learn? Was he passing along the concepts and the themes from John? You said he was a hearer of the Apostle John. So is it just what he learned from John? We know he was not one of the apostles, but we can assume that he had a deep desire to preserve and pass along what he taught.
Yeah, so he wanted others to know, and he wanted to pass along the answers to questions such as, now this is not from him, this is from me, but when you know what he did. He answers questions like, what did the apostles actually say? What did the apostles teach about Jesus? How can we make sure that truth is passed on very faithfully? So things like that, that's the benefit that, among other things, that Papias brings to us in the church.
And I think maybe we've already seen this in some of the men that we've discussed on the recent podcasts, but his story reminds us that the early church wasn't built on rumors or legends that developed some centuries after Jesus ascended into heaven, right? From Acts 2 onward, right then and there, Christians were concerned with preserving the testimony of those who had been closest to Jesus.
Yeah, that's a great point. And to that end, Papias wrote a 5-volume work called The Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, in which he recorded teachings and details about Jesus and the apostles. Sadly, very sadly, those writings over time have been lost. But portions of those writings were preserved when they were quoted by later Christian leaders and writers such as Eusebius of Caesarea and Irenaeus that we mentioned just a moment ago of Lyon. Those guys quoted Papias extensively in their writings, so we at least in part have some knowledge of what Papias did write in that exposition of the sayings of the Lord.
Okay, so we don't have Papias's original writings today. Like you can't go find those and read those, but through these other people, we still have pieces of what he had written and recorded.
Yeah, that's right. And those pieces are incredibly valuable because they give us a window into how early Christians understood the origins of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Papias tells us, for example, that Mark's Gospel reflects the teaching and preaching of Peter. Now, we understand that today. I don't know that a lot of Christians actually, in fact, do understand that, but Mark was Peter's scribe. And so I think maybe the Gospel of Mark is a little misnamed, but when you're reading Mark, you're reading Peter's teaching and him telling the story of Jesus, which is pretty cool. Of course, Mark was a contemporary, so Mark had an important role to play there too. But I digress as I often do. So we understand about Mark's gospel today because of Papias. He was a great guy. I would love to have that 5-volume thing that he wrote. I mean, can you imagine the things that must have been in there? But God, in his sovereign plan, for some reason, didn't allow it to be preserved for us.
I think it's interesting when you bring up that Mark was actually Peter's scribe. When we think of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I think a lot of us just assume that they each were written by, that was the teachings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Mark was actually Peter's teachings. And I think maybe way back in a high school Bible class, I learned that, but I think I'd definitely forgotten it. So that was a good reminder for all of us today. Or maybe you learned that for the first time.
Yeah, well, we know that because Papias told us that. He also says that Matthew originally composed his gospel in Hebrew, which when he used the term Hebrew at that time, I'm talking about when Papias used the term Hebrew, he could have been either referring to the actual Hebrew language as we know it, or he could have been referring to Aramaic, which is a Semitic language and was spoken in Israel at the time of Christ.
And that was the language spoken by Jesus, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Okay, let's keep moving here. Dad, can you share some maybe pertinent information with us all here that we should tuck away as we learn about these early church fathers? Each person that we have been looking at, you've given us a little bit of a takeaway, some of their, main points, more or less, things that they taught on. So help us out here. Share with us what you have for Papias.
Well, let me just share a few brief to-the-point areas about Papias. And first of all, he exhibited a very strong reliance on apostolic tradition. Strong reliance on apostolic tradition. His theology was deeply rooted in the oral traditions of the apostles and their immediate disciples. Papias's views emphasized the reliability of eyewitness testimony. And you think about that, you go to a court of law, if you go to a court trial or something like that, eyewitness testimony carries a lot of weight. And so he put a lot of weight in the eyewitness testimony from people who had heard Jesus, seen Jesus, been with Jesus. And mostly, of course, that refers to the apostles. And so he placed a tremendous amount of import on the apostolic teaching of some of those disciples.
Okay, I don't want to seem rude here. This isn't as sarcastic as it sounds, but I feel like, of course, he had to lean on the apostolic teachings. Like, what else would there have been for him to draw from?
Well, yes, rude.
It's a legit question. I'm sorry. I knew it was going to come across sounding a little sarcastic.
It's a great point. And to your point, there were plenty of other texts and documents written by, let's say, 100 AD that
Okay.
expound and comment on the teaching of Jesus and the disciples. I mean, we've already learned about the Didache.
Mhm.
There's one called the Shepherd of Hermas, which I think we're going to look at in the next week or so. There were other important writings. And so could you trust those? Were all those correct in what they were saying? And Papias would be like, well, these might be good, but let's go back to what the apostles, we know they were teaching, what the eyewitnesses are saying here. So people were writing all kinds of stuff. Papias preferred oral accounts from those who directly knew the apostles. Often he preferred those over other written texts. And he famously stated this, quote, "I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving voice," end quote. Pretty strong.
And I mean, I think that certainly makes sense. And since he held to that conviction, as I'm thinking about that, I'm really glad that he did. I mean, I think his testimony and what you were saying earlier there answers a question that probably a lot of us have always wondered about. Like, how do we really know who wrote these gospels? And Papias is the one who answers that question for us and confirms that it was Matthew. Mark worked with Peter, you said was his scribe, and then we have Luke and John.
Yeah, exactly. So he exhibited a very strong reliance on that apostolic tradition. Second thing I want you to know about him is his ministry down through the centuries. One of the things we remember about him is how he focused on the teachings of Jesus himself. Papias sought to compile and interpret some of the sayings of Jesus, and again, relying on apostolic sources. He is noted for his early accounts of the gospel writers, and he provided some insight into the origins of specifically the gospels of Matthew and Mark. So very much on the teachings of Jesus. And when we start to think about, okay, well, where did our Bible come from? And how did we know? What do we have that tells us that Matthew wrote Matthew and Mark wrote Mark, and that these apostles were who they said they were, and so forth? So you go back as early as you can, documented things like that. And who you wind up going to is Papias. And again, he knew these people. He knew people who knew these people. He brings great benefit to us in that regard. That's the second aspect I'd like you to know about him. The third aspect is his teaching on millennialism, specifically premillennialism. And so Papias held a premillennial view in regarding the return of Christ. He believed in a literal 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth. And that view reflects a hope for the ultimate restoration and fulfillment of God's kingdom. So we know that he taught and wrote about eschatology, and he was one of the very first and earliest to write about premillennialism.
So, kitchen table theologian, if the words millennialism or eschatology just made you stop and question and say, what in the world is he talking about? I don't know those words. If that's you, it's okay. We've got you covered. Way back in the beginning of podcast days, episodes 87 to 99 are all about the end times. There's several episodes that cover eschatology. There are 2 episodes on the millennium. So if you need to brush up on your theology, your working knowledge on all those kinds of things, there you go. You can go back and look at those episodes also. Dad, sticking here with Papias. So 3 things. He's got a strong reliance on apostolic teaching, a focus on the teachings of Jesus himself, and teaching a pre-millennial eschatology that emphasized Jesus returning to claim his church before the millennium. I think you said 4. That was 3, right? So tell us, what's the 4th area about Papias that we should know?
And this is the last one, and we'll end the podcast with this. I think we could say his interest in the earliest commitments and practices of the church. He had a tremendous interest. Okay, how did they do what they did? And we're talking about, the beginning of the church from Acts 2 onward. What did they believe? What did they teach? What were their practices? Things like that. And Papias's writings reveal his interest in both the historical details and the theological interpretations of the teachings of Christ. And so he preserved early Christian traditions about the apostles and the disciples.
It's amazing to me as we've been going through this series how vitally important to our faith today were the people of the early church period, right? And most of these people, I'll be totally honest, I have never even heard of, but they significantly have affected the church today. I think Papias really adds a lot of credibility, and he helped preserve, like you said, those early Christian traditions that still affect how we're living out our faith today.
They really do. When you start to examine your own beliefs and well, why do I believe that? Where does that come from? And if you trace a lot of what we adhere to today, you're going to wind up back in the late first century, early second century. You're going to wind up running into a guy named Papias. We ought to be very, very grateful for him. I so wish more of his writings had been preserved, but at least the fragments, the passages that we have of his work, what we have there does provide a window into the beliefs, the practices, the challenges, some of the false doctrines he talks about of the early church. And the writings we have of him, he affirmed the centrality of Jesus's teaching and the apostles' role in transmitting what Jesus taught. So he's a very key figure in early Christianity, Papias of Hierapolis. And he preserved apostles' teaching. He offered insight. We learned a lot from him about the origins of the New Testament in its entirety. Again, very dedicated to apostolic authority and oral tradition. He gives us a solid historical testimony for the formation of our Christian theology.
Thank you so much for listening to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast today. That's a mouthful for me. Sorry. Kitchen Table Theology podcast. I got it. And I do think that even though, Dad, like you said, a large portion of his work has been lost, we have so much insight from the surviving pieces. And I think we all gained a greater understanding today and really an appreciation of how important Papias's life and his writings were. So thanks for listening with us today. If you are enjoying the podcast, would you take just a minute to leave a rating or a review? We do really appreciate your help in getting the word out. Don't forget, you can check out today's episode notes and more at jeffcranston.com. You can also email us anytime. It is pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. Until next time, always remember that the real power of theology is not only knowing it, but applying it. Thanks for joining us at the table.
You've been listening to the Kitchen Table Theology podcast with Pastor Jeff Cranston. Join us next time for more insights into biblical truth. If you'd like to know more on today's topic, please check out our show notes. If you have a question from today's podcast, kindly email us at pastorjeff@lowcountrycc.org. If you're enjoying this podcast, would you consider leaving a rating and review? We deeply appreciate your help in getting the word out. And be sure to subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or in your favorite podcasting app to continue this journey with us as we learn about and apply God's Word to our lives. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time here at Kitchen Table Theology.